The first thing I saw when we walked into my son Dawson's house was my daughter-in-law Bryn lying in bed like the air itself was too heavy for her lungs. Her skin had that washed-out gray that makes your stomach drop, and her water glass sat on the nightstand like it hadn't been touched in hours. My wife Nadine stepped forward and whispered, "Where is he?" But the room answered with silence. Bryn tried to lift her head and failed, and when she spoke, it came out thin. He said he'd be back. He said not to worry. I looked around for a phone charger, a trash can, anything that suggested a person had been taking care of her, and all I found was a pile of unopened mail and a blanket folded too neatly, like someone wanted the house to look fine. My hands started shaking, not from age, not from the flight, but from the kind of anger that makes you feel young in the worst way. I'm 62 years old, and I've carried a lot of disappointments quietly. But there is something about seeing a sick woman left alone that turns quiet into steel. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Nadine tried to make Bryn drink a few sips, and I tried to act calm, but my mind kept replaying the same thought. Our son didn't forget, he chose. I called Dawson twice, then 3 times, and each ring felt like a slap, because I could picture him staring at the screen and letting it buzz just to prove he could. When I finally checked the kitchen counter, I saw the car keys weren't where any normal person keeps them, and Bryn's purse was open like it had been searched in a hurry. Nadine muttered that she couldn't find Bryn's medication, and I made a joke about my own reading glasses being missing in action just to keep her from crying, but the joke died in my throat. Bryn's eyes tracked me as if she was afraid of what I was about to realize, and she swallowed hard before saying, "It's my car. He took my car." Something inside me went cold and clear, the way it gets right before bad news becomes a decision. I didn't know yet who he was with, but I knew one thing. My son was out there living loud while this house held its breath. I picked up my phone again, not to beg him, but to start making sure he couldn't keep running when the truth finally caught up. While Nadine sat on the edge of the bed trying to look calm, I walked through the house like a man counting exits in a burning room. The refrigerator was full of takeout boxes, all dated from the same restaurant, all from nights when someone clearly ate out and didn't come home. I opened one cabinet too fast and nearly knocked over a stack of mugs, then froze, listening, as if the house itself might scold me for being clumsy. At my age, I move slower, but anger gives you strange energy, and suddenly I was checking drawers, counters, even the laundry room, looking for signs of care that weren't there. Bryn's pills were scattered between 2 bottles, mixed like someone had shrugged and thought, close enough, and that made my jaw tighten. I asked her when Dawson had last been home, and she stared at the ceiling, counting quietly on her fingers like a child who didn't want to get the answer wrong. 3 nights, she said, and then corrected herself. Maybe 4. I tried to joke that when I was married that long, disappearing for 4 nights would have gotten me buried under the rosebush, but neither woman smiled. My phone buzzed again with no name on the screen, and for half a second I hoped it was him calling back, apologetic, scared, ready to explain. Instead, it was a message from a neighbor I barely knew, saying, "Saw Dawson downtown earlier. Nice car," with a smiley face that felt like a punch. Nice car, I thought, picturing Bryn's keys missing while she lay here fighting to breathe properly. I sat down too hard on a kitchen chair and felt my knee complain, which only irritated me more because pain had decided to join the conversation. In my head, I kept arguing with the younger version of myself, the one who believed raising a son meant teaching him right from wrong would stick forever. Nadine caught my eye and gave me a look that said, "Don't explode." But what she didn't know yet was that something quieter and far more dangerous had already settled in me. I wasn't going to shout, and I wasn't going to chase him around town like a fool. I was going to let the world, slowly and officially, notice what kind of man my son had become. I stepped outside to get air and immediately forgot why I was there, standing on the porch like an old man waiting for a bus that never came. The sun was bright, cheerful, almost rude, and it made the whole situation feel more insulting. I checked my phone again, squinting because I'd left my glasses inside, and thought how fitting it was that I couldn't see straight while my son clearly didn't want to be seen at all. When I went back in, Nadine was trying to straighten the bed, the way women do when they feel helpless, like neat corners can fix neglect. Bryn apologized to us for being a bother. And that sentence hit me harder than anything else so far. A sick woman apologizing for needing help is how you know something has gone deeply wrong. I told her she wasn't a bother, that she was family, but the words sounded thinner than it used to, like it had been worn down by misuse. In the kitchen, I found Dawson's laptop open to photos of him smiling in bars, arms around women who leaned in too close for comfort. I laughed once, a short dry sound, and said to myself that at least he'd inherited my terrible taste in lighting. Then I noticed the dates, and the laugh vanished because they lined up perfectly with the nights Bryn said she'd been alone. Nadine asked me quietly if we should take Bryn to the doctor, and I said yes. But my mind was already calculating something else entirely. I remembered the car keys, the message from the neighbor, and the way Bryn's voice shook when she said whose car it was. At my age, you stop believing in coincidence, because life has already taught you how patterns work. I told Nadine to stay with Bryn while I made a call, and my voice surprised me by sounding steady, almost polite. As the phone rang, I felt a strange mix of shame and relief, knowing that once I said the words out loud, there would be no pretending this was just a family issue anymore. When someone finally answered, I realized I wasn't asking for help. I was setting a boundary that my own son had crossed without looking back. I gave the officer my name, my age, and then paused because I couldn't remember the zip code, which felt like a personal betrayal at that exact moment. When I finally got it right, my voice settled into that calm tone men use when they're trying very hard not to say something unforgivable. I explained that a vehicle registered to my daughter-in-law was missing, that she was ill, and that the person using it had no permission. The officer asked if I knew who might have taken it, and for a second I stared at the wall, studying a crooked picture frame like it held legal advice. Yes, I said, slowly, her husband. There was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you the story just changed categories. I clarified that I wasn't angry, wasn't confused, and wasn't guessing, which felt strange because inside I was all three at once. Nadine hovered nearby, pretending to organize pills, listening with the intensity of someone counting heartbeats. I tripped over the edge of a rug while pacing and nearly dropped the phone, and I muttered that if I survived this family, it wouldn't be my back that finished me off. The officer asked a few more questions, professional and neutral, and I answered each one with the steadiness I used to save for job interviews. When he said they would look into it, I felt a quiet satisfaction I didn't expect, not joy, but alignment, like the world had finally tilted back into place. After the call, I sat down and noticed my hands were shaking again, this time not from anger but from the weight of what I'd just done. Nadine asked if I was sure, and I told her that certainty is a luxury parents give up when their children stop behaving like adults. I looked at Bryn sleeping fitfully and realized that doing nothing would have been the real betrayal. Somewhere out there, my son was laughing, spending money, pretending his life had no consequences. I leaned back in the chair and waited, knowing the next knock on this door wouldn't be coming gently. Waiting is a special kind of torture when you're old enough to remember payphones and patient enough to know impatience solves nothing. Nadine brewed coffee, even though neither of us wanted it, and I drank it anyway because at my age routine feels like armor. I sat at the kitchen table listening to the clock tick too loud, thinking about all the times I'd defended Dawson to relatives who said he was selfish. Parents are talented liars when it comes to their own children, especially the fathers who confuse silence with loyalty. I checked my phone again and realized I'd been holding it upside down, which would have been funny if my chest didn't feel like it was packed with wet sand. Bryn stirred and asked weakly if Dawson had called, and the way she said his name made it sound smaller, almost embarrassed. I told her no, then added that it didn't matter right now, and I hated myself for how cold that sounded. The truth was, part of me wanted him to stay gone a little longer so the picture would be unmistakably clear. Nadine sat beside me and squeezed my hand, and I felt the quiet agreement between us that this had crossed a line neither of us could redraw. I remembered teaching Dawson to ride a bike, running behind him until my lungs burned, terrified I'd let go too soon. Now he was riding freely again, only this time he'd cut the brake lines himself. The doorbell finally rang, sharp and official, and my heart didn't jump, it sank. 2 officers stood there, polite, firm, and younger than my socks, and I suddenly felt every one of my years. They asked to speak with us inside, and as I stepped back, my knee cracked loud enough to announce its opinion. While they talked, I realized something irreversible had begun, and even if Dawson talked his way out of it, nothing in this family would ever sit the same again. Some lessons arrive late in life, and some arrive wearing a badge, ready to be enforced whether you're prepared or not. The officers sat at our kitchen table like guests who didn't want refreshments, and somehow that made everything feel heavier. I answered questions while Nadine corrected me gently on dates, because time blurs when disappointment stretches too long. They asked about the car, about permission, about when Bryn last drove it herself, and each answer felt like placing another brick on a wall my son had built. Bryn woke up halfway through and tried to sit up, insisting she was fine, which fooled no one except her own sense of pride. One officer told her to rest, using a voice I recognized from doctors who already know the outcome. I noticed my hands had stopped shaking, which scared me more than the shaking ever did. At some point, one of the officers asked if Dawson had a habit of disappearing, and I surprised myself by saying, "Only when responsibility shows up." I tried to lighten the room by joking that my son inherited my stubbornness, but skipped the part about conscience, and even the officers smiled politely. They explained the process, slow and formal, and I realized how much damage can be done without anyone raising their voice. When they stood to leave, one of them said, "We'll find him." And for the first time that day, I believed someone other than me was paying attention. After the door closed, Nadine leaned against the counter like her bones had decided to retire early. I felt something crack inside, not loudly, but deep, like a hairline fracture you ignore until it spreads. I wasn't angry in the old way anymore. I was disappointed in a way that felt permanent. I sat beside Bryn and told her we weren't going anywhere, even if Dawson never came back. Outside, a car slowed in front of the house, tires whispering on the road, and every nerve in me stood alert, knowing the next chapter was already pulling into view. That evening dragged on like an argument no one wanted to finish, every sound in the house feeling louder than it should. I tried to make soup from whatever I could find, managed to burn the bottom, and told Nadine it was a new texture, which earned me the first tired smile of the day. Bryn barely ate, but she kept thanking us after every spoonful, and each thank you landed like a quiet accusation against the man who should have been there instead of us. My phone buzzed just after sunset, and this time it was an unknown number, the kind that never brings good news. A calm voice told me they'd located the car downtown, parked crooked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. They didn't say Dawson's name, but they didn't need to. The silence around it did all the talking. I sat down too fast again and cursed my knees under my breath, annoyed that my body kept reminding me I wasn't built for this kind of stress anymore. Nadine asked what happened, and when I told her, she closed her eyes the way people do when they've already imagined worse. The officers said Dawson would be questioned and released for now, and that phrase, "for now," hung in the air like a warning label. I felt a strange, bitter relief knowing he'd finally been stopped, even briefly, like watching a runaway train hit a red signal. Later that night, after Bryn fell into a restless sleep, I sat alone in the living room staring at family photos that suddenly felt staged. I wondered where I went wrong, then stopped myself, because fathers can drown in that question if they let it pull them under. Around midnight, headlights swept across the window and paused, and my heart gave one hard, tired thud. I knew he wasn't coming to apologize or explain. He was coming because the world had finally said no. When the knock came the next day, slow and desperate, I already understood that whatever power he thought he had was gone, and the cost was about to be paid in full.
I woke up that morning with the kind of headache that comes from holding yourself together too tightly for too long. The house felt different, like it knew something was coming and was bracing itself along with us. I checked on Bryn first, moving slowly so the floor wouldn't creak, because even small noises seemed cruel around her. She smiled when she saw me, a polite little smile meant to protect other people's feelings, and that broke my heart more than tears would have. I told her we'd handle everything, and she nodded the way sick people do when they don't have the strength to argue. In the kitchen, my husband was already awake, staring into a mug of coffee he'd forgotten to drink, and I teased him that if he waited any longer it would qualify as iced. He didn't laugh, but he did blink, which I took as progress. I straightened the living room even though no one was coming over, a useless habit I've had since my 40s, like order can summon safety. Part of me wanted to scream at our son, and another part wanted to wrap him in a blanket and ask where he went wrong, and both parts exhausted me. I've learned that motherhood doesn't end. It just changes its weapons, trading scraped knees for moral failures. When I heard the car slow outside, my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with a cold readiness I didn't recognize in myself. I stood near the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back, older, yes, but steadier than I felt inside. I realized then that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to play the role of the forgiving mother just to keep the peace. Some lines, once crossed, don't invite discussion. They demand a reckoning. When Dawson finally stepped inside, he looked smaller than I remembered, not younger, just reduced, like a man whose confidence had been dented but not yet crushed. He smelled like cheap cologne and night air, and I hated that detail because it meant he'd slept comfortably somewhere while Bryn fought her body alone. He started talking immediately, words tumbling over each other, explaining traffic, misunderstandings, bad timing, all the excuses that sound hollow once you've lived long enough. I raised my hand without thinking, a quiet gesture, but it stopped him faster than shouting ever could. Behind him, I noticed the car outside wasn't ours, and some bitter part of me almost laughed at the symbolism. My husband stood still, arms crossed, the way he used to stand when the kids were teenagers and tried to argue their way out of consequences. I asked Dawson if he'd seen his wife, really seen her, and he said yes too quickly, like a student guessing on a test. I told him she was asleep and that he wasn't to wake her, not yet, because care comes before confession. He tried to joke, something about everything getting blown out of proportion, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. I've burned dinners, shrunk sweaters, and once locked myself out of my own house in slippers, but I have never misjudged a moment like this. I told him the police had been here, and the color drained from his face in a way no apology could fix. For a second, I saw fear replace arrogance, and I wondered if this was the first time life had truly cornered him. He looked at his father then, not at me, and that hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. The room filled with silence, thick and heavy, and I knew we were standing at the edge of a truth that couldn't be softened anymore. I told Dawson to sit down, and he hesitated like the chair might accuse him too. When he finally did, it creaked under his weight, and my husband muttered something about the chair having better judgment than most people in the room. No one laughed, but the tension shifted, just enough to let the truth breathe. I laid out the facts slowly, the way you explain things to someone who keeps pretending not to understand. His wife was ill, alone, and frightened, and the car he treated like a toy wasn't his to take. He interrupted twice, and both times I stopped him with a look that took me 30 years of motherhood to perfect. I told him this wasn't a discussion about feelings, it was an accounting of damage. He rubbed his face and said he was under pressure, and I nearly smiled at how small that sounded compared to what Bryn had endured. I reminded him that pressure doesn't excuse abandonment, and freedom doesn't cancel responsibility. From the hallway, Bryn coughed softly, and Dawson flinched like the sound had slapped him. My husband tried to stand, and his knee protested loudly, which somehow made the moment more human and more painful all at once. Dawson looked between us and asked what we wanted him to do now, and I realized he'd reached the part where consequences feel personal. I told him he was going to listen, quietly, to everything we had to say, and then he was going to face what came next without hiding behind us. For the first time, he nodded without arguing, and I knew the ground under him was finally giving way. I told Dawson that listening was the easy part, and that living with what he'd done would be much harder. He tried to defend himself again, but his voice cracked halfway through a sentence, and the sound of it landed heavier than shouting ever could. I reminded him that when Bryn needed water, comfort, or help standing, excuses couldn't lift her from the bed. My husband shifted beside me, wincing as his knee complained, and he whispered that if pain were currency, he'd be a wealthy man by now. That small comment almost made me smile, but the moment swallowed it whole. I told Dawson that we hadn't raised him to be fearless, we'd raised him to be decent, and that somehow he'd confused the two. He stared at the floor, tracing a crack in the tile like it might offer an escape route. I explained that the police matter wasn't something we could erase with apologies or family dinners. This wasn't punishment, it was consequence, and the difference matters more as you age. He asked if we hated him, and I answered honestly that hatred would be easier because disappointment takes longer to fade. From the bedroom, Bryn called my name softly, and I excused myself, leaving Dawson alone with his father and the weight of silence. As I walked down the hall, I thought about all the times I'd cleaned his scraped knees and how none of that prepared me for this. I realized then that motherhood doesn't end with forgiveness. Sometimes it continues with boundaries sharp enough to cut. Behind me, I heard a chair scrape back, and I knew the confrontation was about to move from words to reckoning. Bryn was awake when I entered the bedroom, her eyes clearer than before, but still tired in a way that worried me. She tried to apologize again for causing trouble, and I stopped her gently, telling her the trouble had existed long before we arrived. I helped her sit up, moving slowly, joking that if I bent any faster my back would file a formal complaint. She smiled faintly, and that small smile felt like a fragile victory. I told her Dawson was home, and her expression tightened, not with relief, but with caution, which told me more than any argument ever could. She asked if he was angry, and I said no, because anger implies power, and he no longer had much of that. From the hallway, I heard my husband speaking in a low, steady voice, the kind he used when he'd already made peace with a hard decision. I realized then that this wasn't just about a marriage in trouble. It was about whether our son would grow up at last or keep hiding behind excuses. Bryn asked what would happen next, and for once I didn't soften the answer. I told her the truth would happen next, and that it rarely arrives quietly. She closed her eyes and nodded, like someone bracing for weather they can't control. I tucked the blanket around her shoulders and thought about how strange it was that care often comes from the people least obligated to give it. When I stepped back into the hall, I saw Dawson standing, pale and unsteady, while his father remained seated, solid as stone. The balance of that image stayed with me, because it showed exactly who had lost ground and who still held it. I knew then that something irreversible was underway, and that by morning, this family would not look the same, but it might finally be honest. The next morning arrived without mercy, bright and ordinary, as if nothing in this house had shifted overnight. I found my husband at the table reading the same page of the newspaper for the third time, his glasses sliding down his nose like they wanted to escape the story too. He muttered that the print must be getting smaller every year, and I told him the world was just getting harder to look at. Dawson hadn't slept. It showed in the way he hovered, unsure where to stand, like a guest who overstayed and finally realized it. Bryn managed to sit up on her own, which felt like a quiet rebellion, and when she did, Dawson's face folded in on itself. He asked if he could talk to her, and I said yes, but only with the door open, because trust doesn't heal behind closed doors. They spoke softly, words too low to hear, but I watched Dawson's shoulders sink with every sentence she delivered. My husband tried to get up to give them space, failed on the first attempt, and grumbled that his knees were staging a protest at the worst possible time. Even Dawson almost smiled at that, and for a second I saw the boy he used to be before choices hardened him. Then the phone rang again, sharp and official, and Dawson froze like an animal sensing danger. I answered, listened, and felt the final piece slide into place with a strange calm. When I hung up, I told Dawson that this wasn't ending with words, promises, or family protection. What was coming next would force him to stand alone and answer for himself, without parents to soften the fall. As he lowered himself slowly to the floor in front of his father, knees hitting the carpet in surrender, I knew the balance of this family had finally shifted for good. I watched my son on his knees and felt no triumph, only a deep, aching clarity that some lessons arrived too late to feel clean. My husband didn't stand up, didn't lecture, didn't reach out, and that restraint said more than any speech ever could. Dawson cried quietly, the kind of crying that isn't meant to be heard, and I realized it was the first honest sound he'd made in a long time. I told him to stand, not because he deserved comfort, but because humiliation is not the same thing as accountability. He did, slowly, wiping his face like a man who finally understood there would be no shortcuts back to respect. The authorities handled what needed handling after that, calmly and without drama, and we didn't interfere or shield him. Bryn began to recover, day by day, with real care around her this time, and the house slowly exhaled. My husband joked one morning that if stress burned calories, he'd finally fit into his old jeans again, and I laughed harder than I expected. That laughter felt like oxygen returning. We helped Bryn make plans that didn't depend on promises or hope, but on stability and choice. Dawson moved out quietly, carrying less than he arrived with, including his certainty. I learned that being a mother doesn't always mean rescuing. Sometimes it means stepping aside so truth can do its work. As for us, we left knowing we had done the hardest thing parents can do: choose dignity over denial. We didn't break. We stood our ground, and in the end, we won back something far more important than control: our self respect.